Hello, this is Nick Latrenta with the Average Joe Wrestling Show. As a follow-up to my last video, again, am just trying out a video format. I have a podcast, but it's been very difficult from a timing standpoint to keep up with the podcast. So I'm just going to try videos out for a little while, see how we do with that. I'll put a link to the podcast in the description below. The podcasts are great. I interview some great people on there, so I highly recommend listening to that. And I hope to get back to interviewing people as well as time goes on here. So I got a topic that I really want to talk about that I don't know how interested wrestling fans will be, but I'm sort of a wrestling historian. And I want to talk about the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance. And I don't know why, but this kind of fascinates me. The history of wrestling fascinates me in general. If you think about it, filmed entertainment in our world's history is not that old. We're talking a little over 100 years. Like, movies started being created in the late 1890s and then eventually changed into what we have today. Television didn't come about until the 50s. And pro wrestling was always a part of these mediums, at the very least starting with television. I don't know about film before that, but, pro wrestling has been around a long time, but really the last 123 years, just like, with movies and television, has it been really in its inception, becoming what it is today. And, it's just interesting to know, well, where did World Wrestling Entertainment come from? Maybe some younger people are watching this. Where did WCW come from? Where did all these championships come from? Now, the NWA has kind of a complicated history because essentially all these things came from the NWA, which is why I want to talk about it. So there is a complicated history. I'm probably going to get some of these facts wrong. I want to say the channel is called Dave Knows Wrestling. If it wasn't that, it was another one. But there's other videos that do fantastic histories of wrestling, including the NWA. So I encourage you to check out those as well. But basically, wrestling promotions and wrestling events, if you will, started popping up in the early 20th century. And by the late 1940s, if you will, a commission got together and essentially said, you know what, we have all these world titles running around. We should really consolidate this into one championship and kind of take things from there. So eventually that's what they did. The National Wrestling Alliance was formed in 1948 and declared one world champion. Okay, so kind of unified all these world titles that were going around. Probably should have done this research before the video. Who their first world champion was is escaping me. I think it might have been Luthez, but that might even be farther back. They have their world title lineage back to probably about 1900 or something, or 1905. But the company itself was formed in 1948. So basically, there's one world championship. And this company, the National Wrestling Alliance, created what is called territories. Okay, so there would be a Florida territory, there would be a Northeastern territory, a Midwestern territory, etc. Okay, all of these territories, smaller companies, subsidiaries, if you will, were part of the National Wrestling Alliance. So there was one world champion that would go to these territories and wrestle. So the territories might have their own champion, like, I don't know, a Florida State champion, for example. But there'd be one world champion, and this champion would also travel to Japan and all over the world as well. Okay, so that went on for quite a while. But, as things go, people started questioning the National Wrestling Alliance and what they were doing. And the American Wrestling Association, the AWA, eventually broke off and said, we're not a part of this NWA thing anymore. We're our own company. We have our own world title. 1963, Capital Wrestling Corporation broke off and became the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, the WWF, which eventually became the WWF, which eventually became WWE, all the same company. Okay. And they declare their own world champion in Buddy Rogers. A little fun trivia for there. If you look at a picture of Buddy Rogers championship, it's shaped like the United States. That's because it was an old US title belt, and that's all they had at the time before they even made their own world title. NWA's probably the most popular territory was Georgia Championship Wrestling, which came about in the 1970s. In the 80s, they renamed it World Championship Wrestling, WCW. So that became their main kind of territory and eventually their TV show on TBS and TNT. Okay. So at one point, Vince McMahon buys World Championship Wrestling / Georgia Championship Wrestling and buys the TV show and the slot. So I want to say this is the late 80s or mid 80s. Ironically, Vince McMahon did own WCW for a little while. This was called Black Saturday, I think, because the NWA and WCW were very much like a Southern promotion, even though it was all over the country. It was really based in the South. So, didn't really work out with him buying WCW, so he sells it to Jim Crockett Promotions. Jim Crockett Promotions is a part of the NWA. Now, this is where it starts getting confusing. So by this point, WWF is really launching itself, okay? And is really starting to take over, and the NWA is starting to lose a lot of power. And if I remember correctly, other territories are starting to break off and just kind of form their own thing. So really, the big thing was NWA World Championship Wrestling, NWA WCW. It's like WWE SmackDown, if you will. Okay. So by this point, the NWA has the big gold belt. Okay. So that's the title everyone recognizes with Ric Flair. Before that, they had what's called the Dome Globe belt or the 10 pounds of gold. Okay. But they had the big gold belt, which was a part of NWA WCW. Now, I know this is probably getting confusing because this always confused me. Now, WCW was starting to get kind of autonomous from the NWA. So, 1991, because, again, they were just starting to refer to the company as WCW, among other reasons, I think. But that, I could be wrong with that, but I believe they were doing that. They declare Ric Flair WCW World Champion and NWA World Champion. So it was one belt that represented WCW and the NWA. Okay. Ric Flair leaves NWA / WCW to go to what was then the WWF. Okay. And he takes the big gold belt with him and shows it on television. So this is a huge deal because this belt represents the WCW world title and the NWA world title. So they sue WWF and eventually get their belt back. But prior to that, they decided, well, we're calling one belt for, NWA and WCW. Let's just make two belts. So WCW creates its own world title. Okay. So now there's a WCW World Championship with its own belt, and there's an NWA Championship with its own belt. Same company, two world titles. Sound familiar? A lot like WWE today, right? Eventually, Ric Flair comes back, and so both the NWA title and the WCW title are being defended in WCW. And WCW is becoming much more autonomous. The NWA is losing a lot of steam, a lot of power, and it would take too long to get into the dispute with it. But the NWA had like a board who would decide the champion, and they wanted someone to be champion, but the creators in WCW didn't. So finally they said, forget it. We're breaking off. So they break off from the NWA in 1993. So WCW didn't even become its own company until 1993. Okay. Now, the thing was, there was this big gold belt. WCW had actual ownership over the big gold belt. So the NWA had to go back to their Dome Globe belt, which they also call the 10 pounds of gold. So I'll get back to that in a second. So WCW now has this big gold belt, which they start calling the International Championship, and they have the WCW World Championship, which was a pretty nice belt too. It was just different. Eventually, these belts are merged together, and they just use the big gold belt. So if I remember correctly, Ric Flair is WCW World Champion. Sting is WCW International World Champion. They have a match, unify the titles, and they just call it the WCW World Championship, but they use the big gold belt. So now WCW is completely distinct on its own, one world championship. Now the NWA, again, has lost a lot of steam. They don't have a world champion, so they're like, okay, we got to do something about this. So what they do is they take their most popular territory called Eastern Championship Wrestling, ECW. Sound familiar? They have a tournament. Shane Douglas wins the tournament, has the NWA world title, throws it down, says, I don't want this. This organization is dead. I declare myself the ECW world champion. Eastern Championship Wrestling then breaks away from the NWA, and we get Extreme Championship Wrestling. Okay? So now the NWA is still without a world champion, and they're scrambling, and their territories are dying out. So they have another tournament. They get a new world champion. And the NWA is basically just limping along all these years until finally Jeff Jarrett comes along. This is after WCW collapses, and says, hey, I want to create my own company under the NWA umbrella. I want to call it Total Nonstop Action, TNA. And so he goes to the NWA and says, hey, how about we work together? I'll create this show / company called TNA, but it'll be under the NWA. We can use your championship and your world championship and your other titles. So they do that. So NWA, TNA was born. And it was basically WCW all over again. Eventually, for whatever reason, it didn't work out. And TNA breaks off from the NWA, and they get their own championship and their own other belts. And NWA is stuck with this situation again, and they have to have another tournament. And again, NWA keeps limping and limping along. So finally, we get to Billy Corgan, who buys the NWA and sort of revives it. I haven't watched it much. I'm considering myself more of a classic wrestling fan now because I have very little time, unfortunately, to watch the products. But I watched NWA on YouTube for a while. Very much enjoyed it. Very old school wrestling. More realistic wrestling, in my opinion. But it's not doing great, but it's another alternative that's out there. And last I heard about it, they're going to get off of YouTube and get on their own TV channel. I'm not sure what yet, but stay tuned for that. And apparently Billy Corgan is going to try to start territories again. And I just read this the other day where I don't recall what it's called or where it's going to be, but they're going to have a territory of the NWA somewhere in the U.S. And he said other companies are contacting him with this. So we could be starting this all over again. Question is this going to work? Is this worth it? Hate to say this. Will anyone care other than me? Again, I find this interesting. But it's always good to have alternatives right out there. I pull for them all. I pull for WWE, AEW, Impact, NWA. I pull for them all. The more the product is out there, the better. So that's a brief, convoluted history of the National Wrestling Alliance. Did you like this video? Like, subscribe, comment. If I got anything wrong, please feel free to point that out. And see you on the next one.